The air in Firebase Phoenix's fall was a liquid shroud, thick with humidity and the metallic tang of damp earth. Sergeant Mac MacMillan wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand, the gesture more habit than necessity. The sweat was instantly replaced. For 3 weeks, the monsoon had held them captive, a relentless, drumming curtain that muffled sound and vision, turning the jungle into an oppressive, indistinguishable green wall. Mac stood at the sandbag perimeter, staring into the swirling mists, his M16 clutched loosely in his hands. He wasn't looking for movement, not really. He was listening to the silence that the rain created, a heavier, more profound silence than any he'd known. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath, and it was slowly, meticulously chipping away at the men under his command. He thought of the new man, PFC Davies, who'd arrived just a few days ago, fresh-faced and full of an unsettling, almost offensive innocence. Davies still looked at the jungle with a kind of fearful wonder, not yet having learned its true, insidious nature. Mac remembered that look on his own face years ago, before the green had seeped into his bones and bled the color from his dreams. He'd seen too many kids like Davies arrive, their eyes bright with a misplaced sense of duty or adventure, only to watch them fade, their light extinguished by the relentless grind of waiting. Waiting, that was the real enemy here, Mac concluded for the 100th time. Not the crack of a sniper's rifle or the sudden, terrifying explosion of a booby trap. Those were brief, violent eruptions that demanded action, a primal response that, ironically, felt almost cleansing in its immediacy. No, the waiting was the slow poison, the erosion of sanity, the insidious whisper that told you every rustle in the leaves was a human shape, every distant bird call a coded signal. It was the weight of knowing that at any moment the world could shatter around you, but never knowing when or where or how. His squad was feeling it. Specialist Chen, their medic, usually unflappable, had started chain smoking, his eyes darting to the tree line with an almost imperceptible quickness. Sergeant Rojo Rodriguez, the fiery point man, had grown quieter, his usual bravado replaced by a simmering, dangerous impatience. He'd catch Rojo staring at nothing, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The rain didn't help. It soaked through uniforms, made everything slick with mud, amplified the claustrophobia of their isolated position. Resupply was spotty, mail even more so. They were adrift, a tiny island of American resolve in an ocean of hostile green, and the tides were rising. Max shifted his weight, the wet strap of his rifle biting into his shoulder. The outpost felt less like a firebase and more like a tomb, each sandbag wall a layer of dirt holding them down. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to recall the scent of pine trees or the feel of clean, dry sheets. The images were faint, ghosts of a life so far removed it might as well have been another planet. This was his reality now. The smell of mildew and fear, the constant drip of the rain, the unspoken question hanging in the humid air, how much longer until we break? He opened his eyes, scanning the tree line again. The jungle, a living, breathing entity, seemed to watch them back, its patience infinite, its intentions opaque and utterly merciless. Davies, new and raw, was about to learn that the deepest battles were rarely fought with bullets. Days blurred into a monotonous, waterlogged progression. The monsoon didn't just intensify. It became a sentient entity, pressing down on Firebase Phoenix's fall, turning the world into a canvas of muted greens and grays. The air was heavy, the visibility often reduced to a few yards, and the incessant drumming of rain on corrugated tin roofs and thick jungle canopy became the soundtrack to their slow descent. Rumors, like the spores of a virulent fungus, began to proliferate. Increased envy activity in the valleys, a hushed voice would claim. They're massing for something big, another would add, usually late at night, in the stifling confines of bunker. The words carrying the weight of inevitability. Mac found himself relying more on his ears than his eyes. The jungle, usually a symphony of exotic sounds, was now a deceptive acoustic chamber. The rain created a million tiny whispers, masking genuine threats, or perhaps, he thought grimly, creating phantoms where none existed. His men started hearing things. The snap of a twig that wasn't a branch falling, the distant rustle that wasn't a jungle creature, the faint echo of a human voice carried on the wind that could be a ghost or a threat. Sleep deprivation was rampant, each man afraid to let his guard down even in the shallowest slumber. Every shadow, every shift in the air became a potential harbinger of doom. PFC Davies, still attempting to hold onto a semblance of his former self, was visibly struggling. His uniform, once crisp, was now perpetually damp and mud-stained. The innocent wonder in his eyes had been replaced by a haunted, wide-eyed vigilance. He'd jump at sudden noises, flinch at the sight of his own reflection in a puddle. Mac watched him during a perimeter watch, Davies' finger white-knuckled on the trigger guard, his gaze fixed on a clump of bamboo, as if expecting it to spring to life. "Anything, Davies?" Mac had asked, his voice low. Davies had just shaken his head, his lips moving as if to speak, but no words came out, only a slight shiver. His idealism was not just crumbling. It was dissolving like sugar in the monsoon rain, leaving behind a bitter, empty residue. Specialist Chen, observing from the aid station, confirmed Mac's fears. "They're not just tired, Sergeant. They're brittle, like glass. Every one of them." Chen, usually the stoic rock, had a new crease in his brow, and his medical kit seemed to be seeing more use for headaches and tremors than actual combat wounds. "The fear of what's coming, or what's not coming, is worse than any bullet, Mac. It's eating him alive from the inside out." Mac knew it. He felt it too, a dull, aching dread that had settled deep in his gut. The constant vigilance, the inability to truly relax, the gnawing uncertainty. It was a psychological torture far more insidious than any physical pain. The jungle was no longer just a place. It was a character in their drama, a silent, omniscient observer, and its presence was actively driving them mad. They were trapped, not just by the NVA, but by the relentless, suffocating embrace of the monsoon and their own spiraling paranoia. The whispers in the rain were growing louder, and Mac feared they were beginning to hear them from within their own minds. Routine patrols from Phoenix's Fall had become exercises in extreme tension, each step taken with a weight that felt heavier than the jungle itself. The squad moved like specters through the oppressive green, the rain a constant companion, slicking their weapons, soaking their boots, and muddying the already treacherous terrain. Mac led the way, his senses hyper-alert, every nerve ending screaming a warning. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a human form, every distant rustle a potential ambush. He found himself reliving past patrols, the faces of men long gone flashing behind his eyes. Miller, who'd stepped on a mine so small it barely made sound. Ramirez, taken by a sniper they never saw. The ghosts of his past walked with him, a silent, accusing Greek chorus, each reminding him of the constant fear of making a fatal mistake. Today, the air was particularly thick with dread. The mist clung to the trees like a shroud, reducing visibility to mere feet. Rojo, usually a relentless force, moved with a hesitant, almost jerky gait, his M16 sweeping the jungle in frantic arcs. Davies, pale and drawn, stumbled over roots, his eyes darting wildly. Mac could feel the tremor in the boy's hands when he briefly touched his shoulder during a halt. They had been out for hours, navigating a winding, overgrown trail known only as the Serpent Spine when it happened. Mac, moving with the practiced stealth of a hunter, felt a faint, almost imperceptible tug at his ankle. A tripwire. His blood ran cold. He froze, hand instinctively reaching for the safety on his rifle. His mind screaming, "Wire!" He hissed, his voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the rain-muffled silence like a knife. The squad instantly hit the dirt, a symphony of thudding gear and held breaths. Silence. Agonizing, prolonged silence. Mac lay pressed against the mud, his heart hammering against his ribs, listening for the inevitable explosion, the sudden spray of shrapnel. Nothing, only the drumming of the rain. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly, carefully extended his hand, his fingers brushing against the taut wire. It was thin, almost invisible, cleverly strung across the path. But it wasn't connected to a mine. It led into a thicket of vines where it had been disturbed. Then a sudden, frantic rustling from the undergrowth. A blur of brown fur and a small, terrified wild pig burst from the bushes, squealing as it crashed through the foliage and vanished. A collective exhale rippled through the squad. Then, Rojo exploded. "A damn pig. We hit the dirt for a damn pig," he roared, scrambling to his feet, his face red with a mixture of fear and rage. "Mac, you nearly gave us all heart attacks over a goddamn pig." Mac slowly got up, his own adrenaline still coursing. "Better a pig than a bouncing Betty, Rojo," he said, his voice level, but his hands were shaking. "You want to take that chance? We're getting jumpy, Mac. We're seeing things that ain't there." Rojo retorted, gesturing wildly at the jungle. "This rain, this quiet, it's turning us into a bunch of old women." "It's making us careful," Mac countered, his eyes hardening. "It's making us alive. And if you can't handle that, Rojo, then maybe you should be back at the wire, polishing brass." The argument hung heavy in the humid air, thick with unspoken tensions. Davies, still lying prone, stared at the spot where the pig had emerged, his face a mask of profound exhaustion and despair. The near miss, though harmless, had only amplified their frayed nerves, pushing them closer to the edge. The jungle had played its cruel trick, and they had all, once again, fallen for it. The real enemy wasn't just outside, it was now in their own minds, sowing discord and doubt, turning them against each other. A rare break in the monsoon provided a brief, illusory respite, coinciding with the arrival of a delayed mail chopper. The roar of the Huey was a momentary balm, a sound of connection to the outside world, however fleeting. Mail call was a sacred ritual, a fragile thread linking them to a life that felt increasingly like a distant dream. Mac watched as the men clustered, their faces etched with a desperate hope, tearing open envelopes with a mixture of eagerness and trepidation. Each letter was a small, dangerous dose of reality. He received one from his sister, a cheerful, rambling account of backyard barbecues and local gossip. He read it mechanically, the words forming images that felt alien and impossibly distant. How could they be talking about lawn sprinklers when he was fighting to keep his sanity in a mud-caked bunker? The chasm between their worlds felt vast, unbridgeable. He tried to write a reply, his pen hovering over the cheap paper. What could he say? "Dear Sarah, the jungle is trying to eat us alive, and I spend my nights staring into the void, convinced I'm going mad?" No. He wrote about the weather, about eating rations, about how he was doing fine. The lie felt like a betrayal, a testament to his inability to articulate the true horror, to share the weight that pressed down on him. PFC Davies, meanwhile, clung to an upbeat letter from his girlfriend. He read it twice, a wistful, almost mournful smile on his face. She says they went to the drive-in, Mac. Saw a double feature. He sounded so young, so lost. She misses me. Says she can't wait for me to come home. The words, intended to comfort, only served to amplify his isolation, highlighting the vibrant, carefree life he was missing, the stark contrast to their muddy, desperate existence. Mac saw the flicker of pain behind the forced smile, the tightening of his jaw. The letters were a double-edged sword, offering a glimpse of normalcy only to make the current reality feel even more unbearable. Rojo, however, received no mail. His usual simmering impatience began to boil over. He kicked a loose sandbag, sending a spray of dirt. "Nothing," he muttered, his voice laced with a bitter resentment. "Not a damn thing. Guess they forgot all about us." He slammed his fist against a wall. They're out there living their lives, not giving a damn about what we're going through here. They don't know, they don't care. His anger, Mac realized, wasn't just about the lack of letters. It was a profound frustration, a feeling of being abandoned, forgotten by the world they were supposedly fighting for. The mail call, meant to boost morale, had instead inadvertently sharpened the internal fractures within the squad. Chen, observing the tableau, simply shook his head. "It's always the hardest part, Mac," he said, his voice quiet. "The reminders of home. They make you strong, and they tear you apart all at once." He picked up a discarded envelope, its sender's address a beacon from another world. The brief connection, the fleeting moment of humanity, had only succeeded in amplifying the invisible walls growing between them and the outside, and between the men themselves. The silence after the chopper departed felt heavier, burdened with unspoken longing and growing despair. The subtle rot had begun to set in, not just in their gear and uniforms, perpetually damp and moldering, but in the very fabric of their cohesion. The psychological toll escalated, manifesting in ways Mac hadn't anticipated. Petty arguments, once easily defused, now turned vicious, fueled by sleep deprivation and frayed nerves. A misplaced ration, a borrowed lighter, or even an unintended jostle could erupt into a shouting match that left lingering resentment. The enemy outside was still unseen, but a new, insidious enemy was taking root within the perimeter of Phoenix's Fall. Then, the accident started. First, a grenade, its pin somehow pulled, rolled harmlessly into a mud puddle during a routine cleaning, drenching specialist Chen supplies. Chen, usually meticulous, swore he'd double-check the pin. A few days later, M60 machine gun, critical for base defense, inexplicably jammed during a test fire, its components seemingly misaligned in a way that defied simple explanation. Rojo, tasked with maintaining it, flew into a rage, convinced someone was deliberately messing with his weapon. Mac felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. These were mere mishaps. The men were too well-trained, too disciplined for such repeated failures. He watched his squad, searching for a tell, a glance, a flicker of guilt or malice. He saw only exhaustion, suspicion, and a growing paranoia reflected in their eyes. Was it deliberate sabotage? Or was it something far more unsettling? A psychological breakdown so severe that it manifested as unconscious self-destruction, a desperate, internal act of rebellion against their impossible circumstances? He called a squad meeting, the rain drumming a monotonous rhythm on the bunker roof. "Listen up." Mac's voice was strained, trying to project authority he wasn't sure he still possessed. "These incidents, they're going to stop. Either someone's messing with our gear, or we're all so damn tired we're forgetting how to tie our boots. Either way, it ends now. We watch each other's backs. We check our equipment. We act like soldiers, not like a bunch of bickering kids." His words, however, hung in the air, hollow and unconvincing. He saw the doubt in Davies' eyes, the simmering anger in Rojo's. Chen merely observed, his expression unreadable, but Mac knew the medic understood the depth of the problem. They were cannibalizing themselves, their own fears turning them inward, creating fault lines where none had existed before. The enemy didn't need to attack. They just needed to wait for them to unravel. The accidents were not just equipment malfunctions. They were symptoms, harbingers of a deeper, more profound internal sabotage. Mac realized with a chilling certainty that the enemy wasn't just outside the wire. It had breached their mental defenses and was now operating from within. Then, the silence descended. It wasn't the muffled roar of the monsoon, but an unnerving, profound quiet that followed a sudden, inexplicable cessation of the rain. The jungle, usually alive with the cacophony of insects and unseen creatures, felt utterly still. The distant thud of artillery, the faint rattle of small arms fire from other sectors, all ceased. For 2 days, an eerie, suffocating lull enveloped Firebase Phoenix's Fall. It was worse than any firefight, more terrifying than any close call. This quiet was the sound of a spring being coiled tighter and tighter, the prelude to an explosion they knew was coming, but had no idea when or where. Mac felt it in his bones, a primal instinct screaming danger. He ordered heightened vigilance, double patrols, constant eyes on the wire. But even his commands felt hollow, swallowed by the oppressive calm. The men were on edge, their nerves stretched taut, each moment of silence amplifying their terror. They jumped at their own shadows, flinched at the sound of their own breathing. Without the constant threat of immediate combat, their minds began to conjure horrors, filling the void with their deepest fears. Davies, who had retreated further into himself, started seeing things. During his night watch, he'd swear he saw movement in the tree line, figures melting back into the shadows. "Mac," he'd whisper, his voice raw with terror. "Did you see that? Just there by the triple strand." Mac would stare into the impenetrable darkness, seeing nothing but the oppressive green, yet feeling the icy tendrils of doubt. He knew Davies wasn't lying. The boy was genuinely seeing phantoms, his mind creating the enemy it so desperately anticipated. Rojo paced the perimeter like a caged animal, his frustration reaching a fever pitch. "This is bullshit, Mac," he spat, his voice low and guttural. "Just hit us. Get over with. This waiting is going to kill us before they do." His anger was a brittle shell over a core of sheer terror, a desperate plea for action, any action, to break this suffocating silence. Chen, meanwhile, was doling out more sedatives than ever, his face grim. "They're unraveling, Mac," he stated simply, watching a soldier stare blankly at his rations, unable to eat. The human mind can only take so much. It needs conflict or resolution. This is neither. Mac knew. He felt it in himself, the constant hum of anxiety, the gnawing suspicion that every moment of peace was merely a deeper trap. The NVA, he suspected, understood this psychological warfare far better than conventional tactics. They weren't waiting to attack with bullets and bombs. They were attacking with silence, with the very fabric of their own minds. The eerie lull was not a reprieve. It was a weapon, slowly, meticulously, grinding down their will, turning their own psyches into the battlefield. And Mac, watching his men dissolve before his eyes, knew they were losing the battle, one agonizing, silent moment at a time. The brittle silence shattered with brutal abruptness. The jungle, which had held its breath for days, suddenly exhaled in a flurry of violence. It wasn't the massive assault Rojo had yearned for, but a swift, surgical contact designed to amplify their already frayed nerves. Mac was at the communications bunker when the first crack of an AK-47 ripped through the air, followed almost immediately by the frantic chatter of an M16. "Contact! Perimeter! Sector Alpha!" A voice screamed over the comms, laced with terror. Mac grabbed his rifle, adrenaline flooding his system, a familiar, almost welcome rush after the suffocating lull. This was a battle he understood. "Rojo, Chen, Davies. Move! Sector Alpha!" They sprinted through the mud, the sounds of engagement growing louder, the distinctive thump of a grenade launcher, the answering roar of a machine gun. When they reached Sector Alpha, chaos reigned. A small NVA reconnaissance team, no more than half a dozen men, had probed the wire, attempting to breach a weak point under the cover of the returning, lighter rain. Rojo, his earlier frustration replaced by a laser-like focus, moved with a terrifying efficiency. He laid down suppressive fire, his M16 spitting tracers into the thick foliage, forcing the enemy to keep their heads down. Davies, despite his recent breakdown, reacted with an instinct born of survival, returning fire, his face a mask of wide-eyed terror and grim determination. Chen, ever the medic, moved quickly behind the line, assessing the wounded, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the surrounding pandemonium. Mac directed fire, barking orders, his eyes scanning for flanking maneuvers. The skirmish was short, sharp, and brutal. The NVA team, realizing they couldn't breach the wire and facing determined resistance, pulled back, melting into the jungle as quickly as they had appeared. The firing ceased, leaving behind the acrid smell of gunpowder, the echoing silence, and the heavy breathing of the shaken American soldiers. It was over in less than 10 minutes. But in that brief, intense exchange, they had lost one of their own, a young private named Miller, who had only been with them for a month. He lay slumped against the sandbags, a gaping wound in his chest, his eyes staring sightlessly at the gray sky. The sudden burst of violence had, for a fleeting moment, been a perverse relief from the psychological torture of waiting. It was action, it was immediate, it demanded a physical response. But the relief was short-lived. As the adrenaline drained away, the tension returned, compounded by the chilling reality of Miller's death. The enemy hadn't just probed their defenses. They had taken a life, leaving a fresh wound in the already battered psyche of Firebase Phoenix's fall. The fight had confirmed their fears, validating the paranoia, and reinforcing the brutal truth that even when the direct combat ended, the psychological battle was far from over. The aftermath of the fleeting contact was grim, the reality of death a cold, unforgiving presence. The small skirmish, though brief, had left an indelible mark. Mac oversaw the retrieval of Private Miller's body, the routine task feeling impossibly heavy. Davies, who had been standing guard over Miller's position, looked utterly broken, his face pale and streaked with mud and tears. He kept staring at Miller's lifeless eyes, as if searching for an answer there, or perhaps for forgiveness. The boy had witnessed combat, had pulled the trigger, had survived, but the price of that survival was etched deep into his soul. Mac filled out the endless reports, the bureaucratic jargon, a stark contrast to the brutal reality of the jungle. Casualties, enemy contact, positions. The words felt meaningless, unable to convey the raw terror, the desperate courage, or the profound sorrow of losing a man. He questioned his own leadership, his decisions. Had he been too slow? Had he placed Miller in a vulnerable position? The endless waiting had made them all jumpy, sloppy, less effective. He wondered if the NVA hadn't just targeted a weak point in the wire, but a weak point in their collective resolve, exploiting the psychological fragility that had been steadily gnawing at them. Specialist Chen worked quietly, efficiently, treating the few superficial wounds, but his gaze kept returning to the faces of the living. Physical wounds are the easy part, Mac, Chen said, his voice low, as he bandaged a scraped arm. These guys, they're bleeding on the inside. Miller's death, it just opened up all the old wounds, all the fear. He gestured to Davies, who was now sitting alone, head in his hands. Especially him. He saw it all. He saw how fragile life is out here, how easily it can just end. Rojo, after the initial fury of combat, had retreated into a brooding silence. He cleaned his M16 with a meticulous, almost obsessive focus, his movements jerky. Mac knew Rojo felt the loss deeply, his aggression often a shield against his own vulnerabilities. The loss of a comrade, even a new one, stripped away another layer of their already thin resilience. The quiet moments after the firefight, rather than offering relief, were filled with unspoken questions, with the chilling realization that any of them could be next. The rain had picked up again, a soft, mournful drumming on the tin roofs. The jungle outside seemed to sigh, absorbing the last vestiges of the violence, patiently waiting for its next victim. Mac looked at his squad, their faces etched with grief and exhaustion, their morale a fragile thing, battered by the constant psychological assault. Miller's death wasn't just a casualty of war. It was a casualty of the psychological siege, a grim reminder that the real enemy wasn't just shooting at them, but systematically dismantling them from the inside, piece by agonizing piece. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. How much more could they endure before they all succumbed to the hidden agony? The tactical probing, the brief, brutal skirmishes suddenly escalated into something far more insidious. The NVA began a deliberate, psychological siege against Firebase Phoenix's fall. It wasn't a full frontal assault, not yet. Instead, it was a relentless campaign of mental attrition, designed to break their will before a single large-scale attack was even necessary. Snipers became a constant, invisible threat, not aiming for kills, necessarily, but for the psychological impact. A bullet would thud into a sandbag near a soldier's head or splinter a piece of wood just inches from their face. The message was clear. We see you. We can hit you anytime we want. Every movement outside a bunker became an act of extreme courage. Every exposed moment a gamble. Booby traps, already a constant danger, intensified around the wire. Not just fragmentation mines, but elaborate, cruel devices designed to maim rather than kill, maximizing the screams and the burden on Chen. They discovered spikes laced with poison, tripwires connected to buckets of scorpions, even crudely fashioned sound devices that shrieked like wounded animals. The objective wasn't to overrun the base, but to sow terror, to make every step outside the wire an agonizing decision. Then came the broadcasts. At dusk, usually when visibility was at its lowest, a distorted voice would crackle over loudspeakers hidden deep in the jungle. In broken English, it would taunt them, calling them paper tigers, recounting their losses, even mentioning Miller by name, twisting the knife. It promised them a swift death if they surrendered, or a slow, agonizing one if they resisted. The propaganda wasn't just noise. It was a deliberate, personal attack designed to erode their last vestiges of hope and camaraderie. Mac listened to the broadcasts, his jaw clenched, the words of poison seeping into his own mind. He knew this was the real battle. The NVA wasn't interested in simply defeating them. They wanted to utterly break them, to render them shattered shells of men. He watched his squad, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. Davies, consumed by guilt over Miller, barely spoke, haunted by phantom whispers and the taunts from the jungle. Rojo's anger had curdled into a desperate, barely contained fury, making him reckless, constantly exposing himself, daring the unseen enemy to show itself. Chen, his face a mask of weary pragmatism, simply kept working, treating the minor injuries, the fevers, the tremors, and the growing, pervasive fear. Mac understood now, with a chilling clarity, that the true fight for Firebase Phoenix's fall was not on the perimeter, but within the minds of its defenders. The NVA was not just attacking the Firebase. They were besieging their very sanity. He had to rally his men, to somehow forge a shield against this invisible, psychological assault, before they cracked completely and the real battle was lost without a single shot fired. The psychological siege had brought them to the brink, but Mac knew surrendering to the despair was a luxury they couldn't afford. He watched his men, ghosts in mud-caked uniforms, their eyes reflecting the torment of weeks under relentless mental assault. The NVA's tactics were working. Internal fractures were widening into gaping chasms. Davies was teetering on the edge of a full breakdown, consumed by guilt and the constant taunts from the jungle. Rojo, a powder keg, seemed intent on self-destruction, recklessly exposing himself, challenging the unseen enemy to take him. Mac knew he had to act. He gathered the remnants of his squad in the main bunker, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and unspoken fear. There was no pretense of a briefing. This was an intervention. Listen up. Mac's voice cut through the oppressive quiet, sharper than any knife. They want us to break. They want us to turn on each other. They want us to give up. And damn it, they're winning if we let them. He looked directly at Davies. Davies, Miller's death wasn't on you. This isn't about blame. It's about survival. You hold your position. You keep your eyes open. That's all we ask. He moved to Rojo. Rojo, your anger is making you reckless. We need you sharp, not suicidal. Every man in this squad is vital. We lose one more, it's a victory for them without lifting a finger. Mac then did something he hadn't done in years. He spoke of his own fear, the constant tremor he felt, the moments he doubted everything. He laid bare his own vulnerability, not as a sign of weakness, but as an act of shared humanity. We're all scared, he admitted, his voice low, raw. Every damn one of us. But we don't let that fear consume us. We acknowledge it, and then we fight through it together. He then reinforced discipline, not with threats, but with a renewed sense of purpose. We double down on our patrols. We check our gear twice. We watch each other's backs like our lives depend on it, because they do. We talk to each other. We eat together. We pull together. We become a unit again, not a collection of broken men. He told them stories, not of glory, but of perseverance, of other times when the odds seemed insurmountable and they had pulled through. He showed them that their shared suffering was not a weakness, but a bond, a desperate, gritty communion. The change wasn't immediate, but a flicker of grim determination sparked in their eyes. Davies, though still fragile, met Mac's gaze, a hint of something other than despair. Rojo, his shoulders slumping slightly, finally cleaned his M16 with a less frenetic energy. Chen, watching from the corner, gave Mac a small, almost imperceptible nod. The NBA broadcast continued, the snipers still probed, the booby traps still waited. But something had shifted inside Firebase Phoenix's fall. They were still waiting, still enduring, still wounded. But they hadn't shattered. They had acknowledged the true battlefield was within their own heads. And in that realization, they found a renewed, albeit fragile, sense of shared purpose. The psychological scars were deep, indelible, but they hadn't been entirely consumed. Mac stood at the perimeter once more, staring out into the ceaseless rain, the weight of command still heavy on his shoulders, but a flicker of grim determination in his eyes. The fight was ongoing, internal, and never truly ended, but for now, they were holding the line. The rain, ever present, seemed to mirror the unending flow of time and torment in Firebase Phoenix's fall. Mac stood at the edge of the perimeter, his silhouette etched against the murky dawn, a sentinel against both a visible and invisible enemy. Weeks had passed since the intense period of psychological siege, and while the NBA's tactics had shifted, the underlying tension remained, a persistent hum in the humid air. They still probed, still broadcast their taunts, but the squad had found a new, albeit fragile, equilibrium. They hadn't won a decisive battle in the conventional sense, but they had endured, holding the line against the far more insidious enemy of their own minds. Davies, though forever changed, no longer retreated into himself. The guilt over Miller's death still shadowed him, a ghost he would carry, but he had found a new resolve. He moved with a quiet competence, his senses sharpened by trauma, his gaze steady. He sometimes still flinched at sudden sounds, but he no longer broke. He had learned to live with the fear, to harness it, a stark testament to the resilience of the human spirit when pushed to its absolute limits. He even started speaking more, sharing his anxieties, which in turn allowed others to voice theirs. Rojo, his aggressive edge still present, had channeled his rage into a focused vigilance. He was the first to spot new snipers' nests, the quickest to react to a probing force. His recklessness had been tempered by Mac's intervention, and a new understanding of collective survival had taken root. He still grumbled, still chafed under the endless waiting, but his loyalty to the squad, forged in the crucible of shared psychological torment, was now unshakable. He understood that his fury, when unchecked, was a weapon turned against his own. Specialist Chen continued his quiet work, his hands busy with bandages and pills, his eyes observing everything. He was their anchor, a pragmatic presence who understood the unique wounds inflicted by this war. He spoke less of physical injuries and more of the insidious mental toll, offering a listening ear, a quiet word of support, sometimes just a shared silence that spoke volumes. He had seen too many men break, and he was determined to ensure this squad would not be among them. Mac, the weight of command a permanent fixture on his shoulders, had learned that true leadership in this war was less about grand strategy and more about the delicate art of maintaining morale, of battling the unseen enemy that resided within. He understood that the real victory wasn't in overrunning an enemy position, but in holding onto the sanity, the humanity of his men. They were not unbroken. The scars were deep, etched into their very beings, manifesting in haunted eyes, in sudden tremors, in the nightmares that plagued their fitful sleep. But they were not shattered. The monsoon continued its relentless cycle. The jungle remained an inscrutable, hostile presence. There would be more waiting, more skirmishes, more unseen threats. The war for Firebase Phoenix's fall was far from over. But as Mac looked out into the rain-swept green, a grim determination settled in his chest. They were still here, battered but not beaten, a testament to their hidden agony and their enduring, fragile will to survive. The real battle was indeed inside their heads, and for now, they were holding the line, one agonizing breath at a time, knowing the fight would never truly end.